Okay, so welcome back for our Type 3 panel. I'll do a short introduction and then we'll hear from our panelists. And we have Wendy, Patrick, Kimmy, and Dave. So thank you for being on our 3 panel. So Type 3 is the second type in the heart triad that we'll talk about today. Type 3 is what we call the core point of the heart triad, in that it's in the middle and it's one of the vertexes of the inner triangle of the Enneagram. It kind of means that 2 and 4 are variations on 3, in a way. 3 is the core point. And 3 is also the point which is the prototype for all of us, for just the fact that we all have a personality. So 3s identify with the personality or the image, and then in personality, they don't really realize that they're more than their personality. They get very identified with an image and then almost confuse their real self for their image, which is something we actually all do. We all identify with our personality and think that's all of who we are, when really, according to the Enneagram teaching, we're much more than just our personality. So at the core of Type 3 is a kind of confusion of their real self for the image that they take on in the world as a coping strategy to get what they need. And for the 3s, it's a little bit like 2s in that they had an early experience often of not feeling loved or approved of or appreciated for who they really are, but more in the sense of different than the 2s, which are more about what they do for people or being pleasing or supportive of others. It's more, for 3s, it's more about having an image of success or achievement. And it's both the actual accomplishment of tasks and goals and achieving of status, and also a looking good, a kind of a fulfilling an image that is socially approved of in whatever context they're in. So 3s are very good at kind of reading a room or reading the context, and almost automatically ascertaining what is valued in that context, seen as successful, seen as something that is desirable, and becoming that. The defense mechanism is identification, so it's as if they identify with the image of what's approved of and become that, and then, of course, in personality, believe that's who they are. And so this can usually be a taking on of characteristics and a presentation that fits a particular image. And for 3s, again, it's more about having a sense of what's seen as successful or admirable, more of a personal, like, pleasing or supportive thing than it is for 2s. So because for 3s, it's the coping strategy is about being seen as successful or being admired, they get very good at doing whatever it takes to be successful. So they tend to be very task-focused, very work-focused, very goal-oriented, really good at kind of figuring out what's the goal I want to achieve and finding the most direct and efficient line from A to B. How do I get to the goal? So it's almost like a laser beam focus on the goal that allows them to achieve a lot because they're really good at identifying what is the result I want to achieve and how can I get there? And then they do what it takes to get there. So they can be very productive, very effective at work, and there is a lot of focus on work. Now, 3s are heart types, right? Which means they are emotional types. There is a myth about 3s, or a misconception that 3s are not emotional, right? So the thing is, they are heart types and they are very emotional, but part of their coping strategy is based on basically turning the volume down on emotions. So they're good at kind of not acknowledging, this is unconscious, of course, kind of numbing out their emotions, not tuning into them, focusing on something else so that they're not in their emotions. Now, one of the reasons why 3s work so hard is because they're avoiding their emotions, and they have to work really hard to avoid their emotions. So this is why people think, well, they're not emotional, they're not in touch with emotions. The emotions are really there. They just aren't always in touch with them, because if you think about it, if you're someone who wants to get a lot done, emotions will slow you down. I have a good friend who's a 3 who says, emotions are not aerodynamic. right? Or another 3 friend says, emotions have a high drag coefficient. Right? So if you're in a mood, like us 2s can be in a mood, sometimes I don't feel like getting things done, right? But 3s are more about getting things done, and so they're really good at not allowing a mood or an emotion to slow them down. Now, of course, one of the things that happens when they do slow down is feelings bubble up, right? Because they are emotional types. This is why they don't slow down. One of the reasons why, because I have another 3 I know said one time, he knew he was a 3 when he realized he was going to a doctor's appointment, and just the thought that he would have to spend time in the waiting room, potentially for he didn't know how long, he would bring 4 books with him. Now, he's not going to read those 4 books in that waiting, but that's how nervous he was about having any downtime whatsoever. So it's like, don't leave any room because feelings will come up. So they are emotional. And when 3s grow, one of the big things they do is get more in touch with their feelings and more in touch with their emotions. And what they learn is our feelings are exactly the way that we get information about who we are. And learn about who our true self is that's different, that might be different than the image. So sometimes 3s will identify with an image and they'll like go into a line of work that everyone around them wanted them to go into, but doesn't really speak to their deepest desires. But they may not know that until they do some personal work and they get more in touch with who they really are and realize, you know what, I don't really like what I'm doing now that I have the experience of getting more in touch with my feelings and what I like and don't like. So those are some things about 3s. I'm going to see if there's anything else I want to do by way of introduction. I think that's it. Let's leave it there for the introduction and leave it to the experts to fill us in on the rest. So, Wendy, why don't you start us off and just tell us a little bit about how you knew you were a 3 and how you see the type 3 patterns playing out in your life.
So I like to say that I popped out of the womb with a to-do list. And, that was very much reinforced in my family, who were all about making sure that we were accomplished. I was the child of 2 British immigrants, and they had no frame of reference where I was growing up other than what they knew of, which was to reward their children for being successful. And I did that in spades. So I was a straight A student and scholarships and graduated summa cum laude Phi Beta Kappa. Had no idea what I wanted to do. All I knew what to do was to work really, really, really hard. And so I really identified with the recognition that came from accomplishments. We were talking a little earlier about subtypes. And in my family, my mother always said that the worst thing she could do was raise a vain child. So imagine that you're getting rewarded for being accomplished, but you have to do it on the down low. So I come by my self-preservation subtype, quite honestly. But then the point you were making about finding yourself in, doing something you didn't like to do. I spent 35 years in Silicon Valley doing software and things like that, and I was really good at it. So I'd sort of found my zone of excellence, but it wasn't my zone of genius. But I persevered because I couldn't think what else to do that got me the recognition and also provided the accoutrement of success. So, I got to drive my little BMW, but it was always a used BMW because we don't want to look flashier than somebody else. And then we traded it in for a Prius, right? Because that's, kind of the environmentally correct thing to do. Plus you get the HOV lane, which gets you faster to where you need to go. It was really the latter instead of the former. And then, as happens, I think for a lot of 3s, I ended up with a health crisis because I just ran myself into the ground. I was just working all the time. It was not uncommon to work 70 hours during the week. From a relational standpoint, my husband, who is a type 6, used to ask me to just slow down. And I was like, why? I'm providing. And he's like, yeah, but I married you because I like who you are, not what you do. That concept was so foreign that somebody could actually like me for me without the succeeding and the accomplishment. So it wasn't until I had a health crisis that I sort of discovered that I was a 3.
You're saying a lot of good things. I do want to highlight the subtypes of 3 because of what you said about self-preservation. Yeah. So the self-preservation subtype is a type, most of the books about the Enneagram talk about the social 3, and we actually don't have a social 3 today. We have 1 self-preservation and 3 one-to-ones or sexual subtypes.
I'm actually self-preserved.
Oh, you're self-preservation too. Okay, so we have 2 self-preservations, 2 sexual. So the social 3 is the one that's sort of more, so the fixation and the passion of the type are vanity and self-deceit. Now, it used to be self-deceit was the passion. Claudio Naranjo switched it so that vanity is the passion. Some people still think that self-preservation is the fixation. Either way, we can talk about both of them. Self-deceit, right, sorry. So self-deceit is something where the thing I talked about, how you identify with an image and you don't know who you really are. So sometimes people say 3s lie, but it's not really fair because 3s don't really know they're lying because they just have identified with something and they don't know that they don't know who they are. So that's one thing to say about self-deceit. Vanity is, now what Naranjo says, which I think is brilliant about vanity, is that self-preservation 3s have vanity for having no vanity. So there's a way that they want recognition, just like all the other 3s. They like to be on stage, they're good at it, but they have a little bit of discomfort with bragging or self-promotion. And so they can want to sort of be a little bit more on the down low when it comes to showing off or things like that. So having the used BMW or the Prius, trading it in for a Prius, and I always meet a self-preservation 3 at almost everything I go to. They turned in their BMW for a Prius. It's amazing. It's amazing. And the person the self-preservation 3 is the one who doesn't really want to wear designer clothes with the labels on them. That's the social 3. So the social 3 wants to be more on stage. It's a more aggressive, more competitive 3.
But we still want to look good.
Yeah, of course, still want to look good, all the same 3 stuff. It's just a little bit more modest. And similar with sexual 3s who are a little bit more shy about recognition. They'd rather have other people succeed. So we'll get to that in a minute. So sexual 3s are more about supporting others and being appealing almost in a charismatic way. So just a little bit about the subtypes to orient you to that. And then I wanted to highlight a couple of the things that you said. One is this piece about sometimes 3s will work and work and work, and they don't really slow down and work on themselves until they have some sort of breakdown. And they often describe illness or accident or something that actually stops them in their tracks. Do you want to say something about yours?
Yeah, so I ended up in the hospital with a lab-induced case of pancreatitis and almost died. On my way to the hospital, I was trying to figure out how to get a contract redlined. And at the same time, my friend was driving me to the hospital, and she didn't know anything about my middle name, my social security, and I was incapable of literally giving it. So this is the other thing I think about 3s is that we reveal certain parts of ourselves, but other parts of ourselves we really are very kind of private about. And then I got to the hospital and I'm like, oh, no, I'm a competent professional. I know how to do being sick, which I had no clue how to do being sick. And I mean, I was really, really, really sick. I mean, seriously, to the point where I almost died. First day, the chaplain came in and asked me if I wanted to pray. I said, nope, got this. And by the 7th day, the chaplain came in and I was like, oh yeah, I'll take it. I was like literally on my knees. I will take any form of prayer, any form of crystals, any form of healing. You bring it on. I am now receptive. I have been humbled. And it was really, really scary. And in that moment that we were praying together and she was over by the window, I had an out-of-body experience where I could see myself, I could see her, I could see the light behind her, and I thought, okay, we have to change. There's something that is not working about my life, and that was in 2008, and so it took me about 8 years to get out of my career, but at that point, I was like, I am not identifying with my work. I started training to become an Enneagram coach and teacher through the narrative tradition. And it radically shifted how I valued my life. My life became more about discovering who I am, what my feelings are, how to connect with my feelings. You know those little diagrams that they have with happy face, sad face, mad face, afraid face? That was where I had to start to figure out the whole emotion piece of it because I was so disconnected from feeling.
I want to say just one more thing about self-preservation subtype. So it's the 3 that's a hard worker, plus the self-preservation instinct, which brings in a fear about security and survival. And so it's almost like turbocharges the 3. And so the self-preservation 3 is the 3 that has the hardest time slowing down, has the hardest time stopping and saying, this is enough, this is too much. And so I appreciate you sharing your story because it really reflects how much you hold on to that working and that what got you the good stuff, what got you the rewards of the recognition, because it's just so hard to let go of that. Yeah. Thank you.
Yes.
So Patrick, how did you discover yourself as a 3 and how do you see it playing out in your life?
So I'm extremely new to Enneagram, actually. So being on this panel is kind of forcing me to confront my fear of being the least knowledgeable person about something in the room. But I moved into a house in Berkeley of people who were all very familiar with Enneagram. And the first meal I cooked for like the house involved this one dessert that had like multiple components that each had multiple components to it. And they all walked into the room and they were like, oh, you're a 3. But in kind of exploring like what being a 3 means, I realized that like I grew up in a household with a parent with substance abuse issues and enabler as another parent. And I was always the like emotional child around that, whereas my 4 other siblings were very, they were much better at repressing their emotions around it. So I was always the one called out for being emotional. So that I struggled with that. There was this feeling of being devalued because of that. And then I realized that school was a way that I could gain a lot of praise because I was very good at it, and an activity that I could channel all of my emotions into. So I kind of just bulldozed through my academics and succeeded with that. Into college, into graduate, master's program, and a PhD program where I'm at now. But not a lot of slowing down. And I realized, so in moving here, I realized I was confronting this fear of being in a new area surrounded by people I didn't know, kind of socializing myself to that circle, and trying to perform to be this smart, interesting, funny person that people would want to connect with. And I was talking to a friend who he did this out of being a 2, but he was describing this exhaustion from always performing to be funny, to be confident, to be intelligent for other people. And as he was describing this, I realized that I was like crying as he was talking about this process because I never realized how much work I was doing unconsciously to perform, to meet the expectations of other people. And after that, the day after that, I realized I couldn't really connect with the people around me because I didn't know how to connect with people without performing. And I was so exhausted by performing that I just couldn't do it. But slowly kind of came back to it by what I thought was a more authentic way of connecting, but it was a lot of work to saying, like, how do I interact with human beings while not trying to show off?
And do you have a sense of, do you relate to that piece of creating an image or being aware of an image and how people view you?
Yes. It's depending on the setting, I always want to be the person that I think they will be impressed by. And there was a moment where two friends were like taught, like somehow my personality was coming up, and it seems so strange to me because that two people could perceive the same individual, because I realized that I had no sense of like who I am, so I was like, I don't know how anyone can see me because I have no idea who I am in a sense.
Right, right. And sexual threes can be the most disconnected from themselves of any of the 27 types, because there is so much outer focus and wanting to be pleasing and attract people, both like you're saying in terms of being impressive, but also supportive of others, like genuinely supportive of others. Like they'll work in support of others instead of their own self-aggrandizement, let's say. Yeah.
That is something I have to work through a lot, is to be there for others while not enjoying being the person who can be there for you, who has the skills to help you with something, and just allow myself to be there for someone without any kind of reward attached to that.
Without doing
Yes. Yeah.
something, just being
Yeah.
a friend, let's say, as opposed to sort of earning what you do or earning being a friend through doing something for them. Yeah.
Yeah. Or having the status to be able to help you in a particular way.
Having the status. Yeah. Yeah. So notice that sexual three especially will sound a lot like two, but it's a little more about status and a little more about performance, like you're hearing in his language even, and less about that personal connection or the pride of giving or the control that comes from giving, and more about the role of supporter and in a certain way. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Kimmy, can you tell us how you saw yourself as a three, found your type as three, and how you see it playing out in your life?
So when I first was introduced to the Enneagram, I thought I was a social one because I have issues with being in a social group, but at the same time feeling really repressed about a lot of anger at work and people's personalities. And I went to SOT, which is a module that Claudio Naranjo does, and he didn't say anything, but the second module I went to, he started saying, it's strange you think you're a social one because you smile a lot. Why is it that you smile? And it's really true because you must smile for something. And I do smile a lot. So it's always about this engaging with the other, really trying to sense what is it that you want to see from me, and then sensing whether I can really match up to that image. And so that was kind of like the beginning of my search or exploration of who am I, or how am I? And I think a good example, I'm going to take an example from this autobiography that I had to write for these modules. Basically, you write an autobiography about your emotional experience throughout life, and the anecdotes from those kind of gives you an idea of times in your life where it's been an indicator of who you are. And so in high school, I took a chemistry honor, a very strange, abstract course for me. And I did well, a B. And then a couple of years later, I had the chance to do like an AP course. So I took that, and I even passed the class, or the AP, so you don't have to take it in college. But then I went to college, and I was like, I didn't really learn it completely. So maybe I'll do it again. And this time I did it again, and I was setting the curve. And really, at this point, I was like, yes, this is me. Now I really know it because I'm setting the curve, because I'm sort of like the standard of what the class should be based on. And and this sort of identification of how I want to be seen. So throughout my life, there's this conflict of how do I expect myself to be, and perhaps sometimes not meeting up to that expectation and really feeling crushed about the fact that I'm not how I expect myself to be. And then after college, because my family has always raised me in a way where money wasn't a big ideal, but more about exploration, discovery, art. I really thought maybe I could become a researcher. And even though I was, setting curves on all these tests and all these courses, I came out into the world realizing that I didn't have the brain for it, and I wasn't going to be a top-notch researcher. And if I wanted to stay in the field, I would have to work so hard, but yet be mediocre almost. And I wasn't okay with being mediocre. So I left the research field and I became a pharmacist instead, because I thought that I would be a great pharmacist, an excellent pharmacist, and I would have security, financial security, and a very respected field. But I left the dream of becoming a researcher because, I don't know if it's really a dream, because I thought it was a great ideal to have, to sort of discovering. And so this wanting to be something great, and then kind of seeking out to find that greatness in myself, but oftentimes not meeting that expectation.
And it sounds like that was something you identified with in your family. Like you were picking up something in your family that what's desirable is to be this explorer, this discoverer.
Yes.
And yet when you got closer to that, you felt like, well, I'm not going to be the best at this.
Yes.
And so it was sort of like, that's not okay.
Yeah.
And so I need to find something else.
Right.
Is that right?
Because
Yeah.
a real researcher would be more interested in the science and what is so beautiful about this molecule that's binding to this other molecule. I wasn't interested in that beauty. Some of it was beautiful, but I was thinking of more the bigger picture of, will I be this great person who is leading the field in that area?
Right. And just like, yes, you want to be able to be the best. And so twos avoid rejection, threes avoid failure. And I've heard threes say that a three told me once, I can smell failure a mile away and take another route.
Yes.
So it's almost like that's what the story you're telling is like, yes. I smell, I don't know if I'll be the big winner in that. So maybe I should take another route. Was it a little bit like that?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. I don't like to try new things that I don't think I'm good at.
Yes.
I'm good at a lot of things though, but I like to be the best.
Sure you are. There's plenty to choose from. Yes, that's great.
And one other thing about cars, which I thought was so funny, is I really want a Mini Cooper, but it looks so flashy, and I hear that the engines don't work very well after a certain number of years. So I have a Subaru Impreza, which is just as small and cute, but very practical and very zippy and very functional in practicality and just.
Yes. Yeah. Practicality is important. Getting the job done. Yes. Okay. Thank you so much. Yeah. So, Dave, how did you find yourself as a three, and how do you see it playing out in your life?
It's hard to know where to start, really. 20 or 25 years ago, my life shifted. A marriage ended. My dad died. I went to graduate school, and one of my early teachers, in doing an Enneagram training, said, fill in this sentence, I am what I blank. And I said, well, I am what I do. Because I am. I define myself by my work. And I've always defined myself as being successful in my work. Because if you define me as successful, clearly I'm successful, and clearly this is the path. I'm on the right path because, look, I'm viewed as a success, and that's kind of the point. So, Mom was a 1, and Dad was a 9. So, around my house, there was a right way and a wrong way to do things. And I learned very early on that there's a right way to mow the lawn. There's a right way to take out the garbage. Now, interestingly, I didn't have to do it perfectly like my mother. I just had to do it well enough to where I was praised for it. And to this day, whatever I do, I have to do well enough so that you tell me I'm great for having done it that well. It's,
Good job, Dave.
yeah. Right. So I'll stop talking as soon as you people start applauding. Throughout grade school, I was a success at home, and I was really successful in school because I had to be, because that level of success was expected at home, and God forbid I shouldn't have the image of a good student. But then when things become more social, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th grade, I had to change in order to be viewed as successful. And one of the things I could do in high school was I could hang with the dopers, and I could hang with the jocks, and I could hang with the faculty. I used to go stamp my own cut slips in the attendance office. Morning, Marianne. Because I had that ability to shapeshift that we've been talking about. So I'm going to stop.
So can you tell us, I know that you identify as a sexual 3.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about the way the sexual 3 focuses a lot on supporting others' success and almost succeeds through helping others, and it's not just about your own success?
Right, yeah, and I should probably share the story about how I found out I was a sexual 6, because I love
Sexual
telling
3.
this, sexual 3, because I love the story. Now, earlier, B said she likes sports. She's a real Giants fan. She's a San Francisco Giants fan through and through, and that's not just about liking sports or trying to make somebody else like her for liking sports. She's a Giants fan. So every couple of years at least, we try to go to a game together. And we were at this game several years ago, and she said, "So how are you?" And 2 hours later, I finished talking, and it was about the 7th inning. And I said, "B, I'm struggling to figure out my subtype." And B said, "Dave, you are the poster child for one-to-one subtype, and here's why." She said, "I asked you to talk about how you are." She said, "You didn't talk about you at all. You talked for 10 minutes about your mom. You talked for 10 minutes about your mentor. You talked for 10 minutes about your wife. You talked for 10 minutes about this person, that person, the other person, one story at a time." And that made that one-to-one orientation so clear to me. Yeah. And the way it manifests now in my life is I've finally, like 4 careers into it, figured out that the image that really is me is the person who helps others to succeed and is able to take great joy in that. And I found it before I landed in the hospital, although it was tumultuous, because suddenly you have to feel all those feelings that you haven't felt for a long time. But I consider myself very lucky. You know, I have a lot of, I do a lot of different things, but one of which is teach graduate school. So mentoring my students is very important to me and helping them to be successful. And the reason this didn't work in my previous career is because I took it very personally when they failed, right? That wasn't about them, that was about me. I must have failed because they suck. So, yeah.
Can you say a little bit more about the feelings piece, about how you normally relate to feelings and when they burst through?
God, do I have to? Feelings are not aerodynamic. I love that. I am a deeply emotional human being. I sobbed when Bing Bong died in Inside Out, right?
Remind us who that character was for people.
That character was the imaginary childhood friend of the main character in the show, the little girl in the show. And, we all lose that imaginary friend at some point. It was very pointed the way that was done in that show. I love that movie. My favorite movie, Inside Out. And I would much rather deny my emotions in the interest of being expedient and getting stuff done. Because I love that. Popped out of the womb with a to-do list. That was beautiful. And yet, there's a guy named Michael Doyle. Doyle and Strauss, they wrote a book about how to make meetings work. And I met Michael. He's gone now, God rest his soul, but he came in and taught a class when I was in graduate school. And I can't remember what we were talking about, but he's got a whole cohort of graduate students, and whatever we were talking about, he cried. And I was really blown away by that, and we questioned that, why are you crying? And, well, I'm deeply touched by the topic. And I said, no, that's not what I meant. Why are you crying here? And he said, I've spent a lot of time working on getting in touch with my emotions, and he said, I've learned that there's no percentage in holding it back. And I've never forgotten that. He was just such a great model for me to be able to be more transparent. This is a lifelong battle. More transparent about my feelings.
What does that mean, percentage?
There's no percentage in it. There's not enough of a return on investment. It's not worth holding back. And the cost of showing one's emotions isn't that high. And there's a great payback.
And a cost to holding them back, perhaps.
Yeah, the cost of holding them back is huge. So he was one of my early mentors. I should stop.
And by the way, threes really benefit when they grow by having a role model.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And my role model and mentor is a 9. Yeah.
Thank you. So maybe starting with Wendy again, what has helped you to see these 3 patterns and grow beyond them? You already said a little bit about this in terms of the illness and sort of getting stopped. Since then, sort of what have you become aware of? What has helped you to become more aware of these patterns?
It is a never-ending process. And, I follow the Helen Palmer model of stop, observe, press the pause button, identify the feelings that come up, process the feelings, determine whether or not I'm telling a story about the feelings, and try and do this in real time so that we're not wasting time while we're processing the feelings. I mean, it's hilarious, right? It's this kind of back and forth. But on my growth path, I have tried it all. I've tried meditation. I've tried walking meditation. I've tried labyrinths. I've done Akashic record work. I've, done past life regressions. I have really done not the whole, but I've certainly been committed to my own spiritual growth.
Now tell me this.
yeah.
I've been told by threes that sometimes when they do spiritual work, let's say do meditation, they do it, right? Which actually doesn't help them. Like, and again, I'm not saying that's the way you've done it, but
Yes, it is.
okay.
Okay, so I was in this meditation, and I was asking the prayer, what do I need to do at this point in my life? This was after the 2008 experience to, to just enjoy this path that I'm on, to enjoy the journey of life. And what I heard really clearly from up above, or wherever it came from, was just stop producing, just be. And I thought, oh my God, that's profound. And I went and got my notebook out and I wrote a task list for how to be.
Yes.
Right? And then I got done with the task list and I was laughing hysterically because I thought, okay, I think I just got the joke, right? And
Yes.
so,
Yes.
and what's true, what I experienced when I started down this path was so much grief and so much sadness that almost, I felt like I was going to be annihilated by that emotion, because really what came up was the shame of having spent so much time acting in these roles and feeling like I had spent so much effort on this and it had no meaning for me. And it was deeply and profoundly just sad. And just dealing with that emotion in and of itself. And then I was listening to Jill Taylor, My Stroke of Insight. And she talked about how, from a neurobiological standpoint, we're wired to process emotion in 90 seconds. That from the moment the thought comes in, the emotion comes in, we feel that, the cortisol comes up and blah, blah, blah. And I thought, isn't that interesting? I don't have to hang on to this grief or this sadness. It's not going to annihilate me. And all of a sudden it became one of those things where I really could sit with that emotion, see it go through, not make any judgment about it, let it go. And that has been truly for me the most profoundly helpful thing about my own growth path, is recognizing that the emotions that come up pass through, that they don't persist unless I hold on to them and tell a story about them. And today I feel so much less like a 3. I spent a lot of time in 6. I spent a lot of time in 9. I am blessed to be married to a 6 who oftentimes will ask me, to consider a different point of view. And in the past, what I would do is I would just sort of move right through him, because I was like, okay, now I've got this, right? And now I literally stop and connect with him instead of doing what the instinct to do is, which is to clean the kitty litter box or to do whatever, get the oil changed in the car. So now it's more about what is coming up in this moment that is asking for my attention, and can I be okay with that? And for me, that has been the most helpful thing, because just sitting there and contemplating my feelings or whatever, it doesn't work for me. I don't know what's true for you guys, but I have to do something that allows me to process that emotion in a way that doesn't destroy me.
Right, because it sounds like there's almost fear of the emotions, fear that they'll destroy me or they'll slow me down or I won't be able to do what I need to do if they come up. Is that?
Yeah, it's
that
fear
right?
that I don't have the capacity to handle that. And it's also the image of that grief-stricken person, right?
the
So
image
it's
too.
the image of I'm falling apart here, and I can't fall apart.
I
because
need to be together.
I need to be together, and there's nobody underneath me to pick me up. And that's the other myth that I've had to work on, is that, in fact, I'm
Yes.
surrounded by people who would love to pick me up if I fell apart.
Yes, 3s sometimes believe if they don't do it, it won't happen.
nothing gets
and
done.
everything around them will fall apart if they don't keep doing what they're doing. And it's sometimes hard to let people support you, especially for the self-pres 3. It's like you have to do everything. You're the one that provides security, and it's hard to be vulnerable and depend on somebody else to help you.
That is the hardest lesson, truly, for me.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's depending on others.
Yeah. Can I ask you to share? One time you told me just a great example. You said you started to feel some grief about your father, and then you immediately had the thought, I need to do the laundry.
Yes.
Is that how it happened?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And in fact, that's kind of a consistent tell for me, is that I can feel now in my body where the grief is coming from. I can feel it welling from the kind of the middle of my solar plexus up into my throat. And when I feel that constriction in my throat, that's usually the tell that I'm feeling grief or sadness. Dave's nodding his head. And then I have to think about, okay, so what was the thought that just came in a moment ago? And the thought is oftentimes around the loss of my father, the loss of my dog, something that I am really afraid of. The fires burning down my home, my husband getting in an accident. I make my husband now text me when he's done with a bike ride so that I know that he's safe. And it's so that I can assuage that fear. But that's one of the pieces of growth that's been great, is just being able to feel the where it is in my body.
Yeah.
The somatic piece of it is
Right.
huge. Because oftentimes I think for me, a feeling can, particularly feeling I don't want to feel, there
Yeah.
it went, right?
Yeah.
And then right behind it is usually the feeling will come up, and then I'm like, okay, now I got to take care of what's right in front of me. So even just sitting down and knowing that I've got the sensation coming up, I can feel myself getting out of my chair and going to go do something in the moment that I'm feeling that sense of whatever that uncomfortable emotion is, and it can be anything.
Right. So that sounds like on the path to growth, that's the real edge, is to be self-observing. Okay, I have this impulse to go do something, and something just a feeling just started bubbling up, which motivated this urge to action. Can I slow that down a little bit and notice whether it's in my body or in my heart, like what's bubbling up that I might attend to and slow down and feel, as opposed to go do something. Great, thank you. Patrick, what's helped you to become more aware of these things and to grow?
One easy tell for me is I always find that I'm clenching my jaw in certain situations where I'm just like, and then I know I'm like, you are working so hard to control this situation, how people are perceiving you in this moment. So it's, whenever I do that, I'm like, how can I just let go, let this moment unfold how it does. And a lot of times that turns into me just not speaking in a situation, especially in a group scenario, just kind of letting everyone be, and then being in that.
Which is harder than it sounds for a 3, right? Because again, there can be this sense of if I don't do it, no one will.
Yeah. It's difficult because going home, I still find that my success is almost a lightning rod for the dysfunction.
Can you explain what you mean by that?
That at least there's you being successful because everything else is kind of falling apart, and I'm like, oh, if I am not, there's no stability.
Yes, yes. Again, it's like if I don't do, everything will fall apart. And the high side of 3, which is sometimes called hope, is that Almas describes it as the sure feeling that things will work out even with no effort on your part. The knowing that everything will work and things will happen without you having to be the one to do everything.
It has also helped. I started dating a 4 who, one of the first dates we had, he was like, why are you working so hard to control this situation? And then has implicitly and explicitly just given me the space to be kind of a mess in a moment, and feel everything I need to feel. Yeah. Which has been really good for me.
Right. So allowing feelings, a little bit like for the 2s as well, allowing yourself to be with feelings and getting used to the fact that that's okay.
Yeah, and then lastly, I think because there's so many things I do to garner respect, that I've try to do those things, but when I'm completely alone and no one knows I'm doing it, because I do enjoy like cooking and writing. So it kind of re-socializes me to enjoying them for their own worth and not because someone is saying like, great job.
Right,
Yeah.
right. Doing something for the intrinsic joy of doing it as opposed to how it'll make people see you in a positive light or give you a compliment or recognize you, because it's a lot about recognition for a 3. Yeah, thank you. Kimmy, what kinds of things have helped you to be more aware of these patterns and also to grow?
So I'm not exactly a very verbal person. I like a lot of expression through the body and through music. Lately I've been noticing a lot of sort of control, like how Wendy also describes about how much clenching there is in the body and just like tensing everywhere, and starting to notice when do I have that tension in my body and that control that need to be a certain way, and just tuning into my own body and not being so affected by what I want to show everybody. So that's one thing. And the second is because I'm so affected by other people, and I really like to be around one-on-one situation, and I'm really engaging, and I like the other person, but it pulls so much of my energy out that I will actually allot time for myself, putting on my calendar that, this week I need to spend more and not going out this evening to be with other people, so that I can be a little bit more in tune with just my body or whatever it is that I want to do, or just spending time with myself. So those are 2.
When you are with other people, is it easy to focus on what's happening in the moment with them, or do you find you get pulled away by your to-do list, or what are relationships like for you?
I'm pretty in tune with other people when I'm with somebody. Usually I'm really good and one-on-one, and I really enjoy that. I'm almost like my whole soul is like halfway out of my body towards that person. So I'm not really thinking about other things when I'm with people.
You can really focus, and you don't find that work gets in the way of relationship. You can sort of do both.
Yeah, I feel like I'm when I'm with that person, I tend to be quite in the moment with them.
Great, yeah. And again, 3s are heart types, and so relationships are a big focus. Yeah.
What's the question? No, I was just rocked back by when I'm with another person, my entire soul is halfway out to that person, right? I mean, I love that.
If I like them.
Yeah, right. Yeah. No, that was really touching. We get in our own way a lot because we're so task-oriented that we often appear uncaring. A word that I often use to self-describe is driven. And that's like a clue, that's like a flag that there's a 3 in there, because we approach tasks, goals, success with blinders on. And so I'm trying to think of exactly how you framed this question.
Well, part of it is like what helps you be more self-aware.
Yeah.
What helps you grow out of these patterns by noticing them.
Right. Well, what I notice these patterns by the bodies in my wake.
Yeah.
Right?
Collateral damage.
Yeah, exactly.
Because
It's collateral
it said that
damage.
sometimes 3s are so focused on the goal that they'll sort of run over or get around.
Or ignore or piss off or hurt
anyone who's in your way between you and your goal.
Exactly. And often what I've found is that it's not the people that are in my way, it's their feelings. So, dealing with the feelings,
So just like you might avoid your own feelings, you kind of want to avoid other people's feelings.
Right.
Yeah.
Ain't nobody got time for that.
And again, I think that's the operative phrase. There's not time for that.
Right.
I've often heard threes say something like, feelings aren't productive.
They're not.
And they actually get in the way of
Right.
productivity.
Right. Why would you want to bother with that icky stuff?
And yet,
if you don't, when I was behaving that way, and I still do sometimes, it's a process. But when I was behaving that way exclusively, I found that I would reach a goal, be successful, be perceived as being successful, and not be happy, and none of the people along the way were happy. And I would repeat that over and over and over again until finally I said, screw this. I'm going to do what I want to do. And this was around 25 years ago. As I said, in the same 6-year period, I went back to graduate school, lost my father. He died, so that I had nothing to do with that. My first marriage ended, and oh, by the way, I got sober after having being an alcoholic drinker for 25 years. And I went back to church, and it was a whole transformation. The whole thing changed. Not all my behaviors changed at once, but my orientation did. And I started taking into account some of the bodies in my wake, and I started pursuing these goals and the success and what you think of me and all that stuff in a way where my happiness really played into it too. And what I discovered was the less I cared, the happier I was, and the better I treated you, and the better I treated me, and the more I was aware of how I felt. There was this sense of not being attached. Until I was able to let go of trying to force control, I really had no control.
The less you cared about image?
Huh?
The less you cared about.
The less I cared about image, the less I cared about success, the less I cared about what you wanted. And it sounds callous, but it was very freeing. And old habits die hard. I really, to this day, mistreat people. My wife's going to be on the panel next time, and she can tell you stories. But
Yeah, it's gonna be all about you.
which proves the point.
yes.
Thank you, darling.
Yes. And are you more emotional now?
Yeah, I would think so. I'll have to check with my wife, clearly. No, I've always been emotional, but I never really knew where it came from. And I'd always have to stuff it because I couldn't explain it. And now I don't have a lot of judgment around that. It just is. And yeah, it's, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Anything I haven't asked you about that feels like it might be important to say about about three or anything?
Yes.
Nothing arising? Okay, well, maybe,
Yeah.
Dave said yes. Oh, I thought, yes.
So when you were saying go against the arrow first,
Yes, 6.
6.
I was just going to talk about that, so
Good.
perfect.
I have found it really useful recently when I'm at my worst to ask myself the question, what am I afraid of?
Yes.
Because if I can figure out what I'm afraid of, then I can behave in a more down-to-earth, collaborative way. So you named something earlier that I've found great value in doing and not knowing that I was doing that thing. I had one other thing. So the Richmond Bridge was closed for an hour Thursday morning because of concrete falling off the upper deck, and I was stuck in the backup. I got a lot of work done. And when something is just absolutely uncontrollable, there's nothing to rage against. So I can accept it. I got out. People were talking to each other. How often do you have a chance to walk around the
Richmond
Richmond
Bridge, on the
Bridge, yeah.
bridge.
So,
Right.
yeah, but if there was anything I could have done about it, I'd be doing it,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah. Yeah.
So I really find that spending time alone is really helpful for these emotions to come out because you're talking about fear. I was planning this event last year, and there were moments where I really felt a lot of fear because I had to make so many decisions and I wasn't sure how it was going to turn out. And I literally would spend hours at home just kind of like shaking in fear, and I can't really show that in front of other people. And so all these anxiety, all these emotion, it's helpful to have a space for that because maybe you yourself can accept that, but you don't want other people to see it, at least for 3. So spending time alone has been really helpful, feeling anger, feeling sadness, crying for hours. It's okay in your own space, at least for right now. So.
Yeah. Yeah.
I have to watch Love Actually at least once a year
Is that
just to reconnect with the emotions.
just to get the emotions out? Great, good. So just to say a little bit more about the arrow movements. So yes, when 3 goes to 6 first, it's about slowing down to get in touch with fear, to get in touch with things that they sometimes don't allow space for, concerns, what could go wrong, questioning. Sometimes it's like the goal is right there and there's no question. It's really all forward movement as quickly as possible. They don't like to be slowed down. So in order slowing down, checking in with other people, what problems might I be overlooking because I've just really headed in this direction and going quickly. The other thing is then going to 9. Can you say anything about? Anyone want to say anything about what going to 9 is like for you? That's again the path of growth, sometimes called the stress point.
I think of 9 as hanging out in my pajamas and eating popcorn.
Yes. Yes, it's like, in a way,
relaxation.
It's allowing yourself to be and not just do. So David Daniels used to say that 3s are human doings and not human beings, and they need to learn to just be. And 9s are really good at hanging out and just being, and also connecting more to the people around them, tuning into creating harmony and relationships, and not just kind of doing their own thing. Anything else anyone wants to say about that?
I do 9 a lot these days. I like the description because 9 always feels like jammies and popcorn and potato chips and movies and letting things unfold and just being. I do a lot of that these days. I don't necessarily do it without some level of negative self-talk.
So it's a challenge to allow yourself to just be.
It is, because I've got so many things to do. You want to hear about my to-do list?
And do you always check things off the to-do list?
Sometimes I'll write things on the list that I've already done just so I can check them off.
Right. Yeah. I think other types keep to-do lists, but 3s are the only ones I've heard of that actually check everything off and even will put something on to check it off. And there's a great feeling of satisfaction.
Absolutely.
She has one in her purse. She even takes it with her.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah. Right.
Check. Yeah.
Writing the to-do list alone is just like
Say
so
it.
good.
What is it?
I was saying writing a to-do list alone just feels so good.
You love it. It even feels good to write it
it's
out.
a sense of accomplishment, yeah.
Yes.
But I'm with Dave on the 9 thing because about 2 years ago, I made a decision that I wasn't going to do anything that required a huge amount of effort because I had become so exhausted. And I just wanted to enjoy my life at this point and just see what came up. And I decided that I was only going to do things if I was invited to do them, not because I had issued the invitation. And just creating that space. First of all, just creating that space
To not be the active person who's initiating something, but allow yourself to almost receive and be more.
So guess what's happened?
What?
I have more invitations than I know what to do with. So that I didn't expect, right? Because all of a sudden, because I used to say, well, I can't do that because I've got this, 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 and this. And now people are inviting me and I'm like going, oh yeah, I can do that. Sure, I can do that. Sure, I can do that. And now I'm exhausted in the other direction. So
Right. And everything, that's the thing, the tricky thing about 2s, especially on the 3s, especially on the self-development path is everything can turn into doing, right? Like meditating can be taking a walk, or meditating can be doing meditation, or like going out, having an active social life can be doing that. Going on vacation can involve doing and tasks. Is that right?
Well, so vacations now, my rule is I book the hotel, I book the flights, and so I generally know where we're going, where we're staying, and how to get there, and that's it.
So this is a growth.
Okay, that's not exactly true. Usually there's a bicycle involved.
Okay.
But,
So some sort of bike trip will be planned.
but that's different than what I used to do, which was so now we're doing the Louvre. And if we have time, then we're going to the Rodin Museum. And if we have time, then we're going to go to this cool little cafe, right, to hang out with the beautiful people. Looking beautiful, or maybe not. But no, I don't script it in the
anymore.
way.
So that's a developmental step. Yes.
I'm not sure.
Yes.
It feels like it's moving in the right
Yes.
direction.
Okay. All right. So I want to open it up to questions. So I first want to ask Michael if you have any comments or questions.
Again, a wonderful panel. B, I wanted to ask you, you spoke of the arrows to 6 and 9. Is there a broader significance of the 3 cardinal points, 9, 3, 6, however you define it, as opposed to, are there different qualities to the 3 cardinal points as opposed to the other points?
There are, in that it's thought that each triad, the 2 points surrounding the core point are like variations on that main point. So 2 and 4 would be variations of 3. 5 and 7 would be variations of 6. I also heard there's something about each type, and I'm not going to remember this now. It's not that 3s aren't emotional. It's that they can use it externally, sort of in terms of reading a room, but not for themselves internally, almost. And there's something similar with the 9 and the 6. So there are certain aspects of the core points that are distinctive with respect to the rest of the points. Yeah.
And is there, but the arrows that connect all the points, the law of 7 as opposed to the law of 3. Do I have that right?
Yeah.
You spoke of one as creation and the other as
Sequence.
process.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Could you elaborate on that distinction a little more?
Sure. So the law of 7 is about, it's the idea that there are 7 steps required to complete any process.
Right.
And it's like the musical scale.
Right.
It would be a good example of that. The law of 3 is the law of creation. Now, when we put them together, one of the traits of the process Enneagram is we can almost see it as a steps in a process of self-development. So in the Sufi tradition, they have a lot to say about what 1 means, and 1 as a spiritual station, so not the type at all, but just a point in development. That's the point when we're absolutely in personality and coming from instinct. So we're completely blind to the fact that we're identified with personality and everything's fine. We think everything, because we're in personality, there's no problems, because we're just operating in personality and just trying to do our thing. But when we move to 2, not as a type, but as a point in development, that's the next stage in a process where we get more conscious, a little bit more conscious. We start to be aware that things aren't quite right. You know, a little bit like we've heard people on the panels say, of like, actually, this coping strategy isn't completely working. And more conscious suffering comes in, more desire to be on a growth path. More awareness of the passion. All of these things happen in this move. Now, the 3, point 3, not type 3, is not the next spiritual station. The next spiritual station is point 4. That's the 3rd step in the process. Point 3, at 3, it's a shock point. And 3 and 6 are shock points. And that means something else needs to come in from the outside in order to keep the process going. Now, again, this could be a whole day-long lecture in itself. It's kind of complex, but that just gives you a little bit of a flavor into this, that these are also a map of process, and that these are, that has a lot of significance in terms of human development.
Could you just walk us briefly through the rest? You got us to 3, even though it's complicated. Could you just walk us through the rest of the points?
Is it in your book?
That is not in my book. So at 4, we get in touch with the higher virtue.
Yeah.
We get in touch with more loneliness. We get more in touch with the fact that we are insignificant in the big scheme of things. We aren't the center of the universe like we thought we were. On the Enneagram model, between 4 and 5, there's a gap, and that signifies a kind of dark night of the soul. That we all must go through to go from being aware of the higher virtue at the 4 point, the 3rd spiritual station, until we get to 5, where we get in touch with the higher mental center and the holy ideas. But that dark ocean, the dark night of the soul, it's Persephone's world. It's going into the underworld. It signifies a kind of need to face the shadow. And this is why that gap at the bottom of the Enneagram is very important, very significant. And it's not necessarily, some people think it's a completely negative experience. It's more like a losing ego, a being deconstructed. Now it's scary. There's like an existential fear that comes up because you're losing all your defenses. You're letting go of your defenses, but it's a positive in terms of, higher growth. Now, as you come out of that, kind of dark. Oh, by the way, this is an interesting thing. So we talked about the Odyssey and how it's a metaphorical story of coming home to the true self. And Odysseus, after the Trojan War, visits these 9 lands that he visits. That each of the 9 lands matches, the themes match perfectly, the 9 Enneagram types, and he faces these challenges. And he visits them in order, 9 counterclockwise. If you look at the exact center of the Odyssey, you count up all the lines and you look at the exact center of the whole poem, where is he? In the underworld. He's in Hades. He goes and visits the underworld between 4 and 5, between the sirens, between the Hermes and the sirens. He literally goes to the underworld and talks to a lot of spirits as part of his journey forward. So it's there too, that and it's a little bit like the acorn metaphor I use in the complete Enneagram about how we must break open the shell so that the oak tree can emerge. We need to allow our personality to break down if we're to go to a higher place. Now, on the left side of the Enneagram, in terms of the spiritual stations, at 5, which is the 4th spiritual station, because 3 is a shock point, where something else comes from the inside. And by the way, that thing coming from the outside can either be a higher force that moves us forward or a lower force that moves us backwards. Right? So remember, we're always going forward and backward in the spiritual journey. It's not linear necessarily. So if at that shock point we get a bad influence and we are not open to a higher influence, we're not doing the spiritual work to like praying or whatever it might be that invites a positive influence, being self-aware, for instance, the lower kind of thing opens up and something negative comes in, which could be just habit or going back into sort of a negative self-talk, we go back down. So if we go up to 5, that's where we coming out of the dark night of the soul, Persephone's world, the underworld. We get in touch with the higher mental center and the holy ideas in the Enneagram. Now, by the way, there's also things that go along with all these things that I will not be able to remember. And by the way, my teaching partner, Uranio Pius, he's the specialist in this particular teaching. He studied it deeply because he was part of a Sufi path for a long time. So he knows it better than I do. But things like getting in touch with metaphor, images happens at 4, geometric shapes and different things get in, sacred geometry we get in touch with at these higher stations. Then 6 is another kind of shock point. Again, something else. Usually you meet a spiritual teacher or something higher brings you forward. Now 7, 8, and 9 are, 7 and 8 aren't really talked about a lot by these spiritual teachers who teach this process Enneagram because none of us are really going to maybe be there in this lifetime. We're lucky if we get to 5. Now, the saints and the enlightened ones, enlightenment comes at 6. I mean, these really higher states. But it also, this whole map also is symbolic of the fact that the center of the Enneagram is point 0, pointing up to God. And as we get born, we start there and we come out at 9 and we go the other way on the path down. And so in a way, we can think of the Enneagram as a sphere and almost a spiraling up from an evolving pole to a devolving pole. And when you're going clockwise, there's a kind of ascent in terms of spiritual development. And when you go down, it's a kind of falling down.
Thank you.
Questions for 3s? See, you did such a perfect job. No one has, you've been completely successful in proactively answering everything.
Well done, Dave.
Great.
You guys.
I have a question.
Shannon.
I was curious where resentment falls in. You know, because if it's around image and, you know, striving to meet that, I may be off, but I'm just curious. I'd like to hear where that comes up for you.
And resentment's a little bit of a push down form of anger. So resentment, anger, how does that, what kinds of things, where does that come up?
Well, yeah. Oh, sure. I'll say for me, so as I said, grew up with a parent with substance abuse issues. And then like all the children were kind of told to like, we have to be like normal and functional for her. And then like growing up, I was the most responsible one and everyone else was kind of a mess. So I would constantly be like, I grew up in the same house. How am I the only one who received this message? And to like go home and still be expected to be like the most responsible one. It always feels like this weight that I shouldn't have to carry. And then like there's the resentment of like, why should I have ever had to hold that burden of being the higher achieving, most functional, stable one? So I do have a lot of anger and resentment around that. Yeah. But
Anything else? Yeah.
no, I think it's, but like coming along with that, there's just been a lot of like having to let go of that. There's, I think, this desire to want someone to like make that all better. And for me, it's been a process of just accepting like that all happened and everyone in my family is who they are. And I am who I am. So.
And part of what's good for 3s is just allowing that feeling,
Yeah.
you know, to get clear about that. Yeah.
You want to?
Anything?
So for 3s, I feel like role playing is kind of a significant thing where, for example, like I'm a pharmacist or I'm in the spiritual path or I'm meditating, and so therefore I should be a compassionate person. And to be a compassionate person, sometimes I shouldn't be feeling anger even though someone's really irritating. And so then you repress it, and then just this feeling of a lot of anger inside, but not allowing it to sort of come out. And I do feel a lot of resentment in that sense. And it kind of was more prominent before I recognized that it was kind of a way where I was expecting myself to be a kind of person rather than just allowing myself to be angry, because humans can be angry.
There is no end to my resentment. When I'm at my worst, it's lead, follower, get out of the way. And if you don't, then I'm not really interested in working with you anymore. Because if you're not doing one of those things, you're not helping. And if you're holding me back, I have no interest in continuing to work with you. And I'm doing the best I can controlling the universe. Can't you see that? Don't get in my way, or control it yourself. I don't care.
What about impatience? Is that
It's the same thing. It's all the same thing. We're trying to get there, right? Don't slow me down.
Well, the other thing about impatience that I find is that I get really frustrated with people who don't get it. And it's kind of like, okay,
because
what?
you get it quickly, right?
Well, so it's like standing in the grocery line, and I have my credit card out, I have everything lined up, and the person in front of me, it's just dawned on them that they're actually in a checkout line. And they've got groceries still in their cart, and, you know, they haven't figured out how they're going to pay for it. So they're counting pennies, and I'm just... So now I literally have to use that as a teaching moment for myself, where I go, oh, there I go again. There. And so now, instead of getting angry, I say thank you. And I say, okay, now I get to practice my deep breathing exercises. Full breath, count, you know, and so then, but really there's this sense of other people ought to know what they're doing, why they're there, where they need to be going, what, you know, do they not have map applications on their phone, right? I mean, so
Yeah.
who asked the question about impatience? Are we done yet?
Okay, another question. Yeah, back here.
Is it a trait of the threes to, they're task oriented, do, hit the pillow out like a light? There's like this on or totally off.
No, not for me.
No.
No.
That's a
No, we're working on a different list.
So it's funny, there's a cartoon I show sometimes when I do stuff in companies about three, and it's the first one is the person's at the computer, and then they're at home like doing something like this, and then the next one is they're sleeping, and in their dream they're doing the same thing.
We're multitasking in our dreams.
Right. You want to say something about that?
I was just about to say, I remember reading an article about how like there are these super successful people who just like don't seem to not need to sleep. They sleep like maybe 3-4 hours a night. And I remember being so jealous. Like I would love to like be without sleep, but I'm like, I do need to, but
Yeah.
know.
Terry. Here and here. Yeah.
As a two, connecting on the conversation with threes, what's the connectivity with the holy ideas and getting to the self-realization? What do we share? What do twos and threes share since they're right next to each other?
Well, the holy idea for twos is holy will and holy freedom. And the holy ideas for threes is holy veracity, which is truth, getting in touch with who you really are, and holy hope, which is this thing about I don't have to do anything and I just know that everything will work out by itself. Yeah.
I'm a 3, and I'm interested in hearing more about relationship to the physical body, which for me has a huge amount to do with my 3-ness. When I'm on a path, which is most of the time, I don't have a body as far as I know. It's just all from here up. And I can spend an entire day either doing this or presenting in front of a room and being utterly unaware of the toll on the body. And then collapsing, of course. And you talked about illness as being the only thing that stops you, which I've experienced. But it's also the resource, I find. It's the path back to self, and I'm wondering if that's what
You mean being in the body is the path back to self?
Being in the body, just reminding myself constantly that I've got one.
Yes.
And it's useful.
Yeah. Anyone want to say anything about that?
Yeah, so I can totally relate to that. And my practice, literally, when I'm not in my body, is to get back in my body. And this is something I learned from you, which is to feel my feet on the ground and my butt in the chair. But it's taken me 5 years to undo the damage that I inflicted on my body by ignoring it. Because I suffer from migraines and I had gut issues and a lot of other things. So there was a point for me where ignoring the body came at the price of not having a healthy, happy life. And that is where I think for threes in particular, the self-care becomes so important because I mean, if I'm not literally allowing myself enough time to sleep, time for yoga, time for taking care of my dietary needs, then I really can't move forward. So there's that.
That's why the to-do list is so important.
Well, and that's and the not to do list, right? Because I allow myself a lot of unstructured time anymore because I need it. So how about you guys?
You know, what you said.
Okay.
You can also maybe something to do is like Feldenkrais, or I just took up flute lessons again, and I really found that sort of like the relaxation of the throat and the chest, and because you're spending time on these activities, you become more aware and you're putting attention on these things that you can bring it to your daily life, and it kind of all integrates.
Yeah, but that's where the nourishment comes from.
Right, right. So we do need to stop. I'm just going to say one more thing, and that is that America is a three country. And so sometimes people, Naranjo says that sometimes threes in the US have a hard time finding their type. Because it's so much a given that we identify with image, and there's so much of the stuff that's just part of the collective unconscious that threes do. And so sometimes that's why it can be hard to know, and hard to know who you are, because again, it's part of, and one last thing is that sometimes it's hard for threes to develop because they're rewarded so much for being in personality. In our country, you're rewarded if you make a lot of money and you have a high status and you're very successful and you don't show a lot of emotion. And so sometimes it can be harder for threes to come to the personal growth work because it's like, what's wrong? I coached a guy recently at a high level at a financial company. He's making a lot of money. He's good looking. He's a great golf player. Everything's going his way. He's getting promoted here, right and left. And he's like, well, why would I want to change? You know, I was sort of tasked with being his Enneagram coach. Well, there's nothing wrong here. And exactly. And what he was overlooking in his 360, his feedback was that people didn't trust him. People couldn't connect with him. And I asked him, and the coach who had assigned me to work with him, and said, "Well, did you ask him about that?" And it's like it wasn't really getting in, you know. That wasn't registering with him because, and so I even said she needs to tell the bosses that they need to change his reward structure if they want him to change and develop him as a leader, because and so again, when we have threes that are coming to the work, I want to appreciate all the work you are doing, because in our culture it can be even more challenging because it doesn't seem immediately obvious to why this is a good thing, all this personal growth stuff.
Notice there are no social threes here.
And no social threes here, yes. Okay, yes.
I just wanted to say that
One last, give him the mic so he can be recorded.
not being a social three and not having any social threes, those are the ones who like status and big houses and big cars and the pool and the tennis courts in the backyard and all that stuff. For the longest time, I thought
I have a pool and a tennis.
Okay. Just saying. But the social threes are the more showy threes. And I always, early on when I was learning about the Enneagram, I thought I sucked at being a three because I thought that's what a three was supposed to be. And until B taught me about being a 1-to-1 three, I didn't get it. I'm mostly a three, but not completely because I wasn't a social three.
That is hilarious.
Okay, thank you very much.